She was Hollywood's porcelain doll, flawless smile, golden hair, and the kind of eyes that promised happily ever after endings. On screen, she was the embodiment of charm in The Farmer's Daughter, lighting up television screens across America. But behind that picture-perfect frame was a woman living on the edge of an abyss. Her nights were sleepless, haunted by the weight of secrets she could never share. She loved a man she could not name in public. She carried a truth that could end her career in an era that worshipped appearances and punished difference. One spring morning in 1970, at just 35 years old, the lights went out. Inger Stevens didn't just arrive in Hollywood, she appeared, as if conjured, like a breath of Scandinavian winter air on a sweltering California afternoon. Born Ingrid Stensland in Stockholm, Sweden. She carried with her the ethereal beauty of her homeland, pale skin that seemed to catch light from any angle, hair spun from gold, and a gaze that was at once warm and distant. When she smiled, it was measured, as though she understood the value of mystery in a business that devoured open books. To the public, she was the perfect blend of European sophistication and American approachability. When she played Katie Holstrom in The Farmer's Daughter, letters poured in by the hundreds, mostly from women who saw her as a symbol of independence and grace. She didn't crash into stardom with scandal or explosive publicity. Instead, she slipped quietly into the American consciousness, building a reputation with each carefully chosen role. From guest appearances on Bonanza and The Twilight Zone to starring in films like Hang 'Em High opposite Clint Eastwood, Stevens displayed a versatility that kept her from being boxed in, at least in the eyes of her fans. She could be the cool, aloof femme fatale or the earnest girl next door, switching between them with ease. In an era dominated by bold, sultry stars like Elizabeth Taylor and glamorous risk-takers like Marilyn Monroe, Stevens represented something different. She was elegance without excess, allure without arrogance. Hollywood press agents were quick to paint her as the thinking man starlet, intelligent, poised, and above the chaos of gossip. The image worked. She was invited to elite Hollywood gatherings, photographed in tasteful gowns, always standing slightly apart from the crowd, as though she belonged but never truly surrendered to it. To the cameras, she was immaculate. Her interviews were polite, her public statements guarded. She rarely spoke about her personal life. And when asked about romance, she would demur with a knowing smile, deflecting the question without ever appearing evasive. This restraint only heightened the fascination. Winning a Golden Globe for The Farmer's Daughter and earning Emmy nominations that cemented her place among the era's leading ladies. Her beauty was featured on magazine covers from TV Guide to Life, each image reinforcing the idea of a woman fully in control of her destiny. And yet, even in the glossy spreads, there was always something in her eyes, a flicker of distance. As if she were looking at a horizon only she could see. The industry, and indeed the country, saw her as a success story, the immigrant who came to America and, through talent and grace, rose to the top. She was proof, they said, that Hollywood could still produce refined stars in an age growing hungry for controversy. But in building that image, Stevens had to lock away entire parts of herself. She was not allowed to reveal the love that sustained her, nor the loneliness that shadowed her every achievement. On screen, every interview, every public appearance was part of the performance. And in that performance, the world saw the Inger Stevens it wanted to see, radiant, untouchable, endlessly composed. What they couldn't see was how much energy it took to hold that image together, and how thin the line had become between the actress and the act. Her earliest memories were of cold winters and a home that felt increasingly empty. Her parents' marriage was already unraveling, and when her mother left the family, Ingrid was just 6 years old. That absence carved a hollow place inside her, one she would spend a lifetime trying to fill. Her father, a restless and ambitious man, decided to start anew in America, leaving Ingrid and her younger brother behind in Sweden for several years. The children were shuffled between relatives, learning early the art of self-reliance. By the time her father sent for them to join him in the United States, Ingrid was 11, arriving not as a wide-eyed immigrant ready for adventure, but as a girl already acquainted with abandonment. Life in America was a jarring transition. The family settled in Kansas, far from the cosmopolitan streets of Stockholm. Ingrid's father soon remarried. But the stability she might have hoped for never materialized. There were tensions in the household, unspoken resentments, and the lingering sense that she was an outsider in her own home. She began to retreat inward, finding refuge in art, literature, and the mirror, where she practiced the poise and charm that would one day become her armor. In high school, she discovered acting almost by accident. A teacher noticed her talent for performance and encouraged her to audition for school plays. On stage, Ingrid could control the story. There was still the girl who had learned not to depend on anyone for too long. By her late teens, she left home, moving to New York to study at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Even nightclub performances where she entertained between sets. But New York in the 1950s was not kind to young women without a safety net. Stevens learned to navigate a city that could be as predatory as it was promising. There were producers who saw her as a pretty face rather than a serious actress. Photographers who dangled opportunity in exchange for private sessions. And an unspoken hierarchy that reminded her daily that she was an outsider, a foreign-born woman trying to succeed in a world dominated by American archetypes. It was during these years that she began a relationship that would define, and ultimately haunt, her. She fell in love with Anthony Solio, an African-American musician and actor. In the era of Jim Crow and entrenched racial prejudice, their romance was not just unconventional, it was dangerous. For a white Swedish immigrant in the public eye to be linked with a black man could mean the end of her career before it even began. They married in secret in 1955. Keeping their union hidden from friends, family, and especially the industry. The secrecy was suffocating. They could not be seen together in certain neighborhoods. Could not travel freely without stares or worse. Stevens became skilled at compartmentalizing, publicly living as a single, desirable young actress while privately navigating the minefield of an interracial marriage in mid-century America. The strain eventually took its toll. By the late 1950s, they separated. And she filed for divorce in 1958. Still, the fact of that marriage would remain a closely guarded secret, locked away until her death more than a decade later. Ingrid's early career successes, guest spots on television, a contract with a major studio, were built atop this hidden foundation of loss, isolation, and compromise. The girl who had been left behind in Sweden, transplanted to the plains of Kansas, was now in Hollywood, playing roles for the public while concealing the truest parts of herself. This duality became second nature. She could stand under hot studio lights, reciting lines as a congressman's charming secretary or a frontier woman braving the Wild West. All the while holding back a personal history filled with ruptured family ties, forbidden love, and years of living in the margins. Ingrid Stevens carried with her a shadowed past that refused to fade. Every smile, every graceful pose, was layered over the knowledge that the truth, if ever revealed, could undo everything. Polished you, and, if necessary, erased you to fit its needs. She had already discarded her birth name, sculpting Ingrid Stevens into a brand, elegant, memorable, and free of the immigrant roughness that casting directors might flinch at. But the name was only the beginning. Her accent, once softly laced with Swedish inflections, was sanded away through hours of vocal coaching until she spoke with the crisp, neutral tones that could pass for any American region. Acting classes drilled her in the art of controlled expression, the lingering glance, the half-smile that could read as flirtation or defiance depending on the scene. Though in its waning years, still had a way of remolding its hopefuls into bankable commodities. For Ingrid, this meant letting agents and producers guide her career trajectory. They marketed her as a modern Grace Kelly, refined, intelligent, yet quietly sensual. She wasn't pushed into the bombshell category like Marilyn Monroe or Jane Mansfield. Instead, she was cast as the poised woman who could hold her own in a man's world without ever appearing threatening. It was a niche she could occupy with ease, and it gave her a distinctive edge. The reinvention also required silence, not just about her private life, but about her opinions in a decade when women in Hollywood were expected to be agreeable ornaments. Inger was well-read, politically aware, and unafraid to form her own judgments, but she quickly learned that speaking too plainly could close doors. She became adept at diplomacy, her eyes carrying a quiet intensity that made audiences lean forward. Each role added another brushstroke to the portrait of Inger Stevens, star, a woman without visible cracks, untouched by the chaos that seemed to follow other Hollywood figures. But the price of that image was steep. She lived alone in a house in Hollywood Hills, her social circle carefully curated to avoid prying eyes. Dates, when they happened, were often arranged more for publicity than for romance. Photographers would catch her at premieres with a handsome co-star, but once the flashbulbs faded, she would retreat back into solitude. Accepting a role meant weighing the risk of exposure, attending certain events meant considering who might be in the room. In a Hollywood that still whispered behind closed doors about the wrong kind of relationships, the truth of her past love was a ticking clock she could never stop hearing. Inger's reinvention was not just about fitting in, it was about survival. As a foreign-born woman in a fiercely competitive industry, she knew she could not afford a single public misstep. The studios might praise her professionalism, but the same system that celebrated her could turn cold overnight if the illusion cracked. She saw it happen to others. She learned the art of selective vulnerability, giving interviews where she hinted at loneliness but never enough to invite pity, speaking warmly of co-stars without revealing real friendships. Her life became a script, and she played it with precision. Yet the more she perfected her public self, the more distant her private self became. Friends noticed she often seemed elsewhere, her mind wandering even in moments of laughter. Some suspected she longed for a life where she could be fully herself, without fear of headlines or judgment. Others believed she had grown so accustomed to performance that she no longer knew where the act ended. By the late 1960s, Inger Stevens was a fixture in Hollywood, respected, admired. Self-containment were becoming the walls of her own isolation. In the eyes of the public, she had achieved the dream, a glamorous career, a name etched in the annals of television history, and a reputation unmarred by scandal. In reality, she was walking a tightrope, knowing that one slip, one revelation, could undo everything she had built. And stand shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood's most bankable male stars. Producers trusted her. Directors sought her precision. Studios valued her ability to deliver both glamour and gravitas without the chaos that plagued other stars. Her resume glittered, a Golden Globe win, Emmy nominations, film roles opposite the likes of Clint Eastwood, Dean Martin, and Anthony Quinn. She could step seamlessly from light-hearted romantic comedy to taut political thriller. And critics praised her for elevating material that might have sunk in less capable hands. In photographs from this period, she is radiant, sleek hair pulled back, eyes lit with that unmistakable mix of warmth and distance, gowns that seemed tailored to her very breath. Publicly, she was the image of control. Her work ethic was legendary. She arrived on set early, knew her lines, treated crew members with the same respect she gave studio executives. In an industry addicted to drama, she was a rare calm, an anchor in the storm. She had perfected the art of self-containment for over a decade, but it left her increasingly isolated. She lived in a tasteful home in the Hollywood Hills, decorated with Scandinavian minimalism. The kind of place that seemed serene in photographs but could feel cavernous and cold when she was alone at night. Friends would be invited over for dinners, she was a gracious hostess, but the gatherings always ended early, and she rarely accepted invitations in return. The strain was not just emotional. Luminous star and the guarded woman with a forbidden past, was exhausting. She began to turn to quiet escapes. Wine at the end of a long day became 2 glasses, then 3. But for someone like Stevens, who had built her entire career on control, they were dangerous cracks in the facade. Her relationships, too, bore the cost. She had admirers, both inside and outside the industry, but intimacy was complicated when so much of her life had to remain hidden. She reportedly had brief romances with co-stars and musicians, but they rarely lasted. But the shifting tides of Hollywood brought new challenges. The late 60s were ushering in a grittier, more experimental cinema. And the wholesome yet refined archetype she had perfected was no longer the default. Younger, edgier actresses were emerging: Jane Fonda, Faye Dunaway, Ali MacGraw, women who could embody the sexual revolution on screen in a way Stevens, with her carefully constructed image, could not. She tried to adapt, taking on more complex, morally ambiguous roles, but the industry's appetite for her brand of elegance was waning. And with each project that failed to make a mark, the pressure grew heavier. Stevens' diary, later discovered by close friends, hinted at the depth of her loneliness. She wrote of feeling adrift and unmoored, of being invisible in a room full of people. Her words were not melodramatic confessions, but matter-of-fact observations, as though she had come to accept that the chasm between her public and private selves was unbridgeable. By early 1970, the cracks were widening. She still worked, still smiled for the cameras, but those who knew her well sensed a quiet withdrawal. There were fewer public appearances, fewer dinners with friends. The official cause of death was acute barbiturate poisoning, suicide. She was 35 years old. In the days that followed, the press mourned the loss of a beloved star, puzzled over the reasons, and printed glowing tributes to her talent and grace. But it wasn't until after her death that the most guarded secret of her life emerged: her marriage to Anthony Solio, the man she had loved in defiance of the era's racial barriers. The revelation stunned fans and colleagues alike. Some were shocked that she had kept such a truth hidden, others, quietly, understood why she had to. Inger Stevens had reached the peak: fame, respect, and a career many envied. But the price had been her freedom, her truth, and ultimately, her life. Inger Stevens' death was not just the end of a life, it was the unmasking of a story Hollywood had never been ready to tell. In the days after her passing, enigmatic star of The Farmer's Daughter, she became a symbol of the personal cost of prejudice, of the silent compromises demanded by fame, and of the cruelty of an industry built on facades. Her fans mourned her with a stunned tenderness, replaying her films and TV appearances as if searching for signs they had missed: a flicker of sadness in her eyes, a pause before a smile. Colleagues spoke of her professionalism, her grace, and her guarded kindness, admitting that few had truly known her. Inger left no children, no memoir, no public farewell. What remains is a body of work that continues to charm and a cautionary tale that still resonates. She became, in death, what she had been denied in life: a woman whose truth was no longer hidden. Today, her story is a whisper in Hollywood's golden silence, a reminder that behind the beauty, the elegance, and the control, there can exist a private war no one sees until it's too late.